Hello, and welcome to today's program, Financial Exploitation by Family. This program is brought to you by the American Bar Association Senior Lawyers Division and the American Bar Association Senior Lawyers Division Elder Abuse Prevention Task Force. I am Deirdre Locke, the Assistant Director and General Counsel for the Weinberg Center for Elder Abuse Prevention at the Hebrew Home at Riverdale. And joining me today is Andrew Capehart, Assistant Director of the National Adult Protective Services Association. Next.
Hi, everyone.
Okay, so, hello. Next. The Weinberg Center for Elder Justice is the place where I work. It is an elder abuse shelter. If anybody is interested in learning more about replication of shelter in your community, please feel free to contact me because we do assist with the development of shelters. The goal of our services is to address elder abuse in the community and work together as a multidisciplinary team to then provide services if somebody is in need of a safe place to go. So as the General Counsel, I provide legal services often to individuals who are in our shelter who need various legal services. All right, enough about me. Let's get into the meat of the program. So I'm going to start with just talking a little bit about what is elder abuse and thinking about a case that will really serve to give us a little bit of a basis to talk about. It's about Miss G. So Miss G is 84 years old. She is a woman who has lived in her apartment for many, many years. She had one adult son who moved away. She had been a nurse. She worked to pay off her two-family home and had tenants who had been a reliable source of income for Miss G for the last decade. Her niece then moved in and had her own drinking issues. She had numerous boyfriends and then one that never left, so he moved in also. This niece had no job. She also had mental health issues. And after a period of time, she was the one who started collecting the rent from the other tenants in the home that was Miss G's. That money wasn't being spent to take care of the home. In fact, at some point, the gas was turned off. The niece also got a pit bull, and that pit bull was often used to scare away anybody who was coming into the home. And she didn't take care of the dog. There were feces everywhere. Eventually, no one ever wanted to come into Miss G's home, and she took her, the niece, actually took her to another attorney to become power of attorney. When asked, Ms. G said that she didn't want her niece to leave, though. Tenants in the building, though, started to really be concerned about her because there was a clear decline. There was a clear cognitive decline. There obviously was a decline in terms of the money management, in terms of the care of the home. And when APS became involved, they never were able to obtain rent statements from the niece showing that the niece had been collecting the rent and utilizing it for Miss G. They couldn't track the money, in fact, in any way, shape, or form. APS actually ended up bringing her to a hospital because they couldn't tell when the last time was that she saw a doctor. It became clear that she was unsafe at home. So, why did I raise this case? Why is this relevant to attorneys? What is the meaning here? Do we think that Miss G is experiencing elder abuse? How do attorneys address that? Well, it's difficult for us oftentimes because there isn't a uniform definition of elder abuse. And without that, the interpretation of what different actions can be taken make it very, very difficult. However, the CDC has recently done a study evaluating the different definitions and accumulating them and coming up with individual definitions. So they state that an intentional act or failure to act by a caregiver or another person in a relationship involving an expectation of trust that causes or creates a risk of harm to an older adult. That is elder abuse. So, in the case of Miss G, do we think that there was an intentional act or failure to act by a caregiver or another person? I think yes. And is that relationship involving an expectation of trust that causes or creates a risk of harm? Absolutely. Where did it happen? It usually happens in the home. Does it get reported? Is anybody detecting it? Well, in this case, Miss G isn't telling anybody about it. There's no evidence that she's reporting it. In fact, if anything, she's saying she wants her niece to still be there. Undetected, well, thankfully the tenant in this situation reached out to Adult Protective Services. Did it involve trust and love between Miss G and her niece and potentially the niece's boyfriend? Yes. Maybe not the boyfriend, but it's a familial relationship. At the heart of this, however, is trying to find out what it is that Miss G would like to do, what it is that Miss G wants. And that can be very difficult to assess. Next, please. So, in terms of elder abuse and domestic violence, I really wanted to highlight this because attorneys, we're often more familiar, I think actually not just attorneys, but everybody in the community is more familiar with the concept of domestic violence and awareness about domestic violence. Often we'll say in the elder abuse prevention world that elder abuse is, 25 years behind domestic violence? Did you say that, Andy? Among the reported cases,
yes, they do. I've heard that same statistic quite a bit, yeah.
But we're catching up. We're trying, people who join this webinar, I appreciate it because clearly it raises as our community gets older and as we say, as the baby boomers are now in the population of people who are aging, this is just becoming more and more relevant. Statistically, a family member is an abuser in 90% of the cases. 2/3 of the abusers were adult children or spouses. And so while financial exploitation can be committed, as we all well know, by way of scam or by way of professionals even, it is often very much at the heart of elder abuse among family members. Financial motivation for the abuse exists in almost all of the cases that we see. So what is the difference between elder abuse and domestic violence? Why do we need to pay attention to elder abuse? Why isn't it not the same thing as domestic violence? Where does it overlap? So to answer that, let's look at the fact that, elder abuse can be domestic violence grown old. So it could be that the elder abuse is, between two people who have been in a relationship in which there has been abuse already and that it just continues as they age. It could also be a relationship that is developed later in life, or it could even be in a relationship that never had been abusive but becomes abusive. And of course, other members, like in the case of Miss G, it was her niece. So what would happen if her niece, Miss G's niece, had shoved Miss G? I didn't give you a lot of facts about Miss G's physical health, but we know that she's 84, and we know that there's some cognitive decline, and we know that she hasn't seen a doctor in some time. So it's very possible that if the niece had shoved Miss G, what would happen would be something very different than if Miss G was, let's say, 24. If she were 24 and shoved, she would likely just stumble backwards, maybe shove her niece back, possibly fall down, get up, maybe do something about it, maybe report it, maybe call the police, maybe leave the area. Are those options available to Miss G? If Miss G were to be shoved, it's possible that she may not get up. We don't know. Perhaps she had a walker. Perhaps she had a cane. Perhaps she breaks something when she falls down and she just is not able to get up. And what if her niece leaves her there? How is she going to then get help. If eventually she does get help, maybe we learn that she's broken a bone and she gets to the hospital and she in some way gets to a phone to call 911. Once in the hospital, if there's a broken bone of some sort, say a broken hip, we're talking about a hip replacement, we're talking about a stay in a hospital, we're talking about rehabilitation. And then who's going to be dealing with everything in the home? What's going to be left there? How is she going to manage that? Will she be able to be as independent as she has been? So clearly the effect of abuse on an older person and their physical body as they age is going to look very different than for somebody who is much younger. In this instance, was there coercive control that solidified the isolation and undermined the personal liberties of Miss G? Absolutely. Look at the use of the pit bull. What did the pit bull do? It ensured that nobody could come to Miss G and reach out to her. So had anybody else, had any other family member, had any other friends, had any other tenants wanted to go into her home and see how she's actually doing, they're more or less prevented by use of this dog. And while not everybody uses a dog to solidify isolation, that is a very common thread in elder abuse cases. And because of the age and perhaps physical limitations of an older adult, they may not have the ability to leave their home as freely. And in fact, oftentimes they're more financially and emotionally intertwined with their abuser. Take a look at the fact that the niece brought her out to have her execute a power of attorney. I mean, we don't know when there was some cognitive decline, and I would like to say that the attorney in the case didn't execute a power of attorney because of the cognitive decline. But as we know, capacity is something that is determined on a task-specific basis, and perhaps there was capacity in the moment, but we don't know. And if Miss G actually wanted her niece to be the power of attorney or expressed it, and just by the mere fact that Miss G didn't actually want her to leave, why would that be? And then what is our role as an attorney? Why would she not want to report what's going on? Why wouldn't she want to tell somebody? Maybe because she's lonely, maybe because she loves her niece, maybe because she feels guilt or shame. I think Andy's going to talk some more about reporting, because so often elder abuse is really not reported, and that makes it and imparts on attorneys even more the need to recognize what's going on, and that attorney, perhaps in the situation of executing the power of attorney, could have recognized something. And why else wouldn't Miss G want to do something to address the situation that the niece is causing for her at home? I mean, what are her options? Could she leave? Where would she go? Would she be able to go through an eviction process with her niece? What if she were to confront her and there were repercussions? And again, think about somebody who, let's just use the age again of 24. If Miss G were 24, it seems a lot more likely that a 24-year-old would be able to leave a situation, physically get out, and do something. If there's not financial dependency, the 24-year-old could potentially get a job and earn her own or his own financial income. An older adult would not be able to necessarily go out and just get a job. So, in fact, it's very, very unlikely. It's not even, it's not really a possibility. And in this case, because Ms. G has some level of cognitive impairment, how then would she report? How then would she recognize? I mean, maybe she doesn't recognize what's going on. Maybe she has no idea that the rent is going to her niece because she herself is experiencing difficulty with financial management. And of course, if there are cultural barriers or language barriers, it just makes it all the more difficult. So, next slide, please. Thank you. So it makes it more incumbent on us, right, what is our role? What is the role of the attorney? What can the attorney do? We can, of course, lean on our friends and help and call and talk to Adult Protective Services because they are, in fact, people who can go into, oftentimes, the home and see what's going on. But why would this attorney, for instance, just execute the power of attorney? They're afraid. They don't think it's their job. They don't know what to do. They're afraid of violating the attorney-client privilege. But to counter that, why in fact should attorneys take it a step farther and do something? I would argue that there are ethical reasons why we ought to. What are the first steps that should happen? Did the attorney speak to Miss G alone and make sure this is what Miss G wanted? Did she have the capacity to execute this at the time? Did the attorney ask any questions of her that would demonstrate her inability to manage her own finances and understand what finances and property she actually has? And if no one else is getting to Miss G, if no one else is going into her home, it may be that that attorney is the only person that has had any kind of contact with her, which makes it all the more incumbent on the attorney to really take the next step and ask some questions to ascertain the safety of Miss G. And getting to know Miss G's community, and in this particular case, if an attorney had concerns, my suggestion always is ask the client to come back. Ask the client to come back again so you have some sort of history of what the person is like and who they are under different circumstances, different times of day. You may be able to recognize something. Okay, next. And this is my last slide. Before I'm going to turn it over to Andy here, I just wanted to mention, and this would take an entire webinar by itself to talk about all the different remedies, but certainly as attorneys there are things that we can do, like going to family court and getting orders of protection and knowing to utilize specific language in the order of protection, or making sure that you're asking for specific requests from the judge. Know that in different states, you're able to ask for probation in family court, and you can tie it to programs. So often when people won't report, it's because it's a family member and they want to help their family member. Like in the case here, maybe Ms. G was concerned about her niece's drinking issues and her mental health issues and never wanted to see her in jail. She wanted to help her. So tie those things into family court proceedings, because it's a mechanism in which people may encourage people to report issues that are going on. Guardianship proceedings, there's been so much talk after the New Yorker article about elder abuse and guardianship proceedings. I'm on the other end of the spectrum in that I think that it can be utilized in such a wonderful way to intervene in elder abuse cases, asking for restraining orders, asking for injunctive relief to freeze bank accounts and assets, asking for select powers from a temporary guardian. And in housing court, I think that is in truth where you see a lot of elder abuse, because it is where a person is not able to stay in their home. And if there is a history that they were able to and they're suddenly not, something likely is going on. Okay, with that, I'm eager to hear, as I'm sure everyone else is, from Andrew Capehart at the National Adult Protective Services Association. I think he is a friend to, his organization is a friend, in fact, really to all attorneys. So I'm excited to learn about the ways in which we will be able to utilize and understand their services.
Thank you, Deirdre. That was very good information. And I just want to give a little bit of information about my organization before I jump too much into the topic we're talking about today. And I will be talking about the APS perspective that complements the perspective that Deirdre just gave us. So NAPS, the National Adult Protective Services Association, who I work for, is the membership association for adult protective services professionals across the country. Membership includes, in addition to APS workers, medical professionals, we have law enforcement folks that are members, and folks who work frequently with APS. We have over 900 members from across the United States, I'm proud to say. We advocate for federal policy that moves the field forward for victims. We do focus on federal policy, federal initiatives, not state initiatives. We have education opportunities for those who work with elder abuse victims in the form of a core curriculum for adult protective services workers, 23 core competencies that APS workers can take so that they're well educated to do their job. And we have an annual conference as well. We engage in some research projects that help us understand the trends in the field and the best way to assist our victims. And then we try to provide as many networking opportunities as we can for our members, and so facilitate a lot of peer support so that the states can talk to each other about how they deal with their issues. And then I have to give a shameless plug for my company's annual conference, which is coming up in August of next year in Anaheim, California. We have 64 workshops on a variety of topics. If you're interested in learning more about that, there's a link there on your screen that you can come visit. We'd love to have you if you'd like to come see us in Anaheim. I'm going to talk a bit about what the research shows us on elder abuse with a focus on financial exploitation, which is mainly what we're talking about today. The research is showing us that the issue is more common than we thought it was, like Deirdre said, that there is mortality associated with the issue, and that there is not only a financial cost to the victims, but a cost to all of us. Elder abuse is very common, it's very lethal, and it is expensive to all of us. So again, elder abuse is common, certainly more common than I think most of us consider it to be. There was a study called the New York Elder Abuse Prevalence Study conducted back in 2011 that showed us it is quite common. This was a project spearheaded by Mark Lax at Weill Cornell Medical College. They did random telephone surveys of state of New York older residents. They conducted them and compared them to reports of abuse that came into law enforcement, came into adult protective services, to domestic violence, anybody where elder abuse issues would be reported to. They compared those with what they got from the telephone survey. And they found that 1 in 13 older adults reported abuse within the last year. That translates to a rate of about 7.6%. And again, this was just in the last year at the time that they asked these questions, not over the course of their lifetime or several years. And it's interesting to note that this rate is the same as coronary artery disease for the same time period, which is a pretty shocking comparison, I think, to all of us. So it's happening a lot. It happens more than we think it does. Other studies found even higher rates for elder abuse. Note that the definition in these studies I'm going to talk about were a little bit broader than just exploitation. So there's the National Elder Mistreatment Study, which took place in 2009 and found an even higher rate of elder abuse. The estimates of the study were that 1 older adult in 10 are mistreated in some way. When it comes to financial abuse by family members, the rate of the incidence was 5.2%. And again, this is only for family members. This does not include the scams that you often hear about both here in the U.S. and abroad. I think we've all heard about some of the financial scams that come from outside the U.S. that are particularly hard to deal with. They can be very aggressive, and they can exploit older adults out of thousands, tens of thousands, or more dollars. And then there was another study by Eileen Wigglesworth and Laura Mosqueda, whose names you might remember in the elder abuse field or have heard of in the elder abuse field, that found that nearly half of all dementia patients, about 47.3%, had been abused by their caregivers in some way, shape, or form in the recent past, which is a pretty staggering statistic, I think. So we can glean from these studies that elder exploitation is underreported. It's just like Deirdre said, it's not reported to law enforcement, and it's certainly not always reported to adult protective services. That first study that I referenced goes on to estimate that for every case reported to an authority, there are actually 23.5 cases that are not reported. So for every 1 case that comes in, almost 24 cases are not reported at all. And again, this was the study that was based on random telephone surveys. When it comes to financial exploitation specifically, that number grows to 44 cases that are not reported. So for every 1 case that is, they glean that there's 44 cases that are not reported to authorities. In this study, older adults reported financial exploitation more frequently than any other kind of abuse. So they were saying that that's what happened the most to them. Most of this exploitation is committed by family members and most often by adult children, unfortunately. Just like Deirdre said, about 2/3 of elder abuse is committed by adult children. This exploitation tends to occur in the community, in older adults' own homes, as opposed to in nursing facilities. And I'll talk a little bit more about what Adult Protective Services investigates as far as what they look at in the community and what they look at in nursing facilities, and the differences among the states about how they investigate those cases. Elder exploitation is expensive to the victims and to all of us. There's kind of a ripple effect that happens when exploitation occurs. In addition to the loss of funds, there's an emotional cost as well. Victims who lose their life savings, lose their sense of well-being, they lose their sense of trust in the system and how the system can help them, whether the system can help them or not. When victims are exploited, financial institutions lose the funds that support them, whether in banks or in other forms of financial institutions. Victims who lose their funds are more likely to use medical services at a higher rate, which we'll explore a bit on the next slide. And then there was a study in 2011 in Utah that found that 9% of elder financial exploitation victims went on Medicaid as a direct result of their abuse. I think it's self-evident that a victim who loses the money they saved their entire life is going to have to depend on the system, such as Medicaid, in order to pay for their medical bills and their care if all of their funds have been exploited. There's actually several states that have looked at replicating this study that happened in Utah, and hopefully we'll see some more data in the same form come out of other states in the next few years. So in addition to being more common than we think and quite expensive, elder abuse is also lethal. The same researcher from the New York State Elder Abuse Prevalence Study found that victims are 3 times more likely to die than their non-abuse cohort. Personally, I think that many of these victims are abused by loved ones and simply just give up after the abuse occurs. I've had some cases that I've worked myself. I worked for 5 years as an APS worker and then 5 years as an APS supervisor on the front lines, and I've seen many clients simply give up when they become disheartened and realize that a family member has exploited them, and it can cause an untimely death. That same researcher also found that victims of exploitation are more likely to go into nursing homes when they're exploited, obviously for the same reasons that I mentioned on the previous slide, where their funds have been exhausted and they have to apply for Medicaid to pay for that. So now I'm going to switch gears and give you just a bit of general information about Adult Protective Services. I sort of assume that most of you on the line for this webinar are familiar with APS in some way, shape, or form. But in case you're not terribly familiar or you've never worked with APS, I'll kind of explain a little bit about who we are, what our code of ethics is. Our purpose is to carry out investigations of not just financial exploitation, but of abuse, neglect, and self-neglect as well. These types of abuse also include physical abuse, emotional or psychological abuse is included in that. Sexual abuse is included in that as well, although sexual abuse is the least number of cases reported to APS every year. Note that nearly all the states who investigate abuse of adults age 18 to 59 who have a disability, though there are a few states who do not investigate this population, and I'll talk a little bit more about this in a bit too. We intervene to protect victims to the extent possible, and by extent possible, I mean within the confines of the law in each individual state, which vary, as I'm sure you can imagine. And then what the client wants to happen in a given case. Many victims, unfortunately, choose not to take any action against their perpetrators, who are often their loved ones, the folks that have abused them, unfortunately. And the APS is the social services entity in each state authorized to receive reports and investigate. There's a state law in every state that pertains to APS specifically, and it varies quite a bit from state to state. And I'm happy to answer questions as we move along about how APS functions in each state, although I don't always, unfortunately, have in my head what every single state's laws are, and I might have to, tell you that I'll get back to you about how APS functions in your specific state. So a bit more about what APS does. We are victim-focused. We are a social services response to abuse. I say this because we're not law enforcement. We're not a criminal justice entity. We focus on helping the victim. We don't focus on holding the perpetrator responsible for their actions. There are other systems that are responsible for that. although there are some APS programs that do have a perpetrator component to them in the form of a perpetrator registry, which does have some crossover into this realm. It's something that my organization is studying because more and more states are looking at putting perpetrator registries in place. It's important to note that the majority of cases that APS investigates pertain to self-neglect or older adults' inability to care for themselves. This is the most frequently reported concern to APS. Self-neglect makes up anywhere from half to two-thirds of the cases usually reported to APS. That being said, states are getting more reports of financial exploitation, and the cases that they're getting where exploitation is alleged are much more complex year to year. Many programs are actually putting in place now specialized APS workers that solely focus on financial exploitation because it's such a unique animal. It's something that takes a lot of attention. And when you have workers that focus specifically on exploitation, they can investigate those cases, focus on those, and they have a little bit more experience with those cases. So we're seeing that happen more and more in programs. They have these workers that just do exploitation or just do self-neglect or other forms of abuse. And I think it's important to mention, I mentioned this in all my presentations, APS work is very difficult, it's very dangerous. As a frontline worker myself, I have had a gun pulled on me when I was in a client's home. There's lots of safety concerns out there with working with these clients, and it's a big part of what my organization does, trying to put training out there to keep these folks safe so that they're as safe as they can possibly be when they're going in to investigate these cases. I'd also like to talk a little bit about the differences in state and local APS programs, that you're aware of the diversity that's out there among policy. Not all APS programs investigate cases in nursing facilities, something I alluded to earlier, and that includes group homes and assisted livings as well. About half of programs do investigate cases in these settings, or about half of states investigate these settings, but the other half do not. And then there are always, it's important to note, there are always other state agencies that are responsible for investigating those cases if it's not Adult Protective Services. But more or less in about half the states, APS is going into nursing homes and doing investigations there. Again, nearly all the states are authorized by state law to investigate cases of abuse for anyone over the age of 18, but the laws governing different populations defined by age vary. So many states investigate anyone over the age of 18 who's quote-unquote vulnerable, so older adults and younger adults as long as they're considered vulnerable. The definition of what vulnerable is varies from state to state. You'll find it's different in what your state is versus a neighboring state. May have different takes on that. Some states will investigate cases of someone age 60 plus, regardless of whether they're considered vulnerable or not. So you will find that some states will go out and do an investigation on anyone over a certain age, usually 60, sometimes 65, regardless of whether they have a disability or are considered vulnerable. And then you have a handful of states, I think it's about 4, that only investigate cases of those age 60 plus. So there is sometimes, unfortunately, no entity in those states that investigate the cases of folks aged 18 to 59 who have a disability. It's a real gap in services for those individual states. And I think it's important to note that resources and training vary considerably from state to state. Some states have very sophisticated systems with lots of resources statewide. Other programs have very limited resources and may not be able to provide the same services that neighboring states can. And then some states have extremely limited resources where they do the investigation. There may not be a whole lot they can do to actually fix that particular case, but just about every state has some form of intervention that they can provide to these victims. So I'm going to talk a little bit about the APS Code of Ethics because I think this helps people understand what's involved in APS and how APS functions. I don't usually read slides, but when it comes to our Code of Ethics, I do tend to read them to emphasize certain pieces of it. So the guiding value or the overarching value is that every action taken by APS must balance the duty to protect the safety of the vulnerable adult with the adult's right to self-determination, and this is paramount for APS workers. This means that there must always be a balance between protecting the victim and honoring what their wishes are. So most victims that APS encounters are competent individuals who understand the consequences of their actions. It's not uncommon for a victim to refuse assistance or even refuse investigation. Some states will continue an investigation with or without the victim's consent, though, depending on state. And then the secondary value, older persons and persons with disabilities who are victims of this treatment should be treated with honesty, caring, and respect. I think that one is self-explanatory. Some other pieces to our code of ethics: adults have the right to be safe. APS must ensure the safety of the victim to the extent that they'll allow us to ensure that safety. Adults retain all civil and constitutional rights, obviously, until a judge decides otherwise, and I know that you guys know this better than anyone, the folks that are on this webinar now. Adults have the right to make decisions that do not conform with societal norms. So a victim may make a choice that most people would not make. It's up to them to decide what will happen as a result of the abuse, even if the community doesn't agree with that choice. And then adults have the right to accept or refuse services. This is really tricky when working APS cases. If a victim wants no help in a situation, then in the vast majority of cases, they are free to refuse some help or even all help in some situations. Just a small note, so I can put on my advocacy hat for a second, about funding for APS. There is, some of you might be surprised to hear, there is currently no federal funding earmarked specifically for state adult protective service programs. There are social service block grant funds which are available. These funds go towards many social services programs. There's a lot of competition for these funds. My organization is kind of always dealing with threats to eliminate the social service block grant. Unfortunately, budgets are just staying static and they're not growing with the increase in the aging population. We do have many more older adults coming along as the years go by. We even have some states that have programs with caseloads of over 100 clients, which is an egregious kind of sin in the world of APS, because our cases are so intensive that if you have 100 of them, there's really not much you can do for anybody. So just a little bit about mandatory reporting, which I think Deirdre alluded to earlier. Nearly all states but one have some type of mandatory reporting to APS. Attorneys are almost always mandated by law to report concerns to APS to check the laws in your state. And then there are 15 states where all individuals are mandated to report any concerns they have to adult protective services. And then there's a growing trend to add financial institutions to the list of mandated reporters. There's at least 11 states right now that have added financial institutions to the list of folks that have to report exploitation if they find it. So these are some of the forms of exploitation by family members that APS deals with. It's important to note that not all exploitation is financial. Some exploitation involves what we call material exploitation, and the misuse of an older adult's resources, such as their home, maybe their car, even their medications, something that we're seeing more and more of. Obviously, exploitation can involve the unauthorized use of an elder's funds. APS often sees the forging of signatures on documents as a form of exploitation, and this can be in the form of a power of attorney, forging checks, or even the sale of a home, documents that designate the sale of a home. And then, obviously, direct stealing of cash or withdrawals from bank accounts or co-signatories is often seen. And then coercion or deception involved in the signing of financial documents, such as a POA, is another tactic that we also see. And then these are some warning signs of exploitation, some things that you might want to be on the lookout for. Obviously, if a senior reports the exploitation, you should report it. I include that bullet point here as a reminder that even if you have an older adult client that you deal with who exhibits some form of confusion, you should always err on the side of believing them and reporting the matter, even if you feel like what they're reporting may not be 100% accurate. Let APS sort that out. Sudden changes in banking practices can be a warning sign. If an older adult changes long-standing financial practices, especially in the presence of someone previously unknown to that person, if they have a new friend that has shown up and is now all of a sudden dealing with their finances, that can be a red flag. Abrupt or drastic changes in a will can signal that someone's being exploited. When belongings go missing and there's no explanation or police report filed about their disappearance, that's a red flag. When services that an older adult needs are not being paid for and suddenly terminated for non-payment, especially when you know that the adult has previously had funds to pay for those services. That's definitely something that should be considered a red flag. And then obviously the rapid depletion of accounts, large withdrawals that are coming out, the emptying of accounts should be seen as a warning sign as well and could indicate that something's happening. And then here are some of the interventions that APS may take to stop exploitation. Sometimes we advocate changing the bank accounts with the client's permission. That could be helpful, especially if there's an exploiter that previously had access to a prior account the client had. Sometimes APS will use representative payee services to begin handling income per client. There are even some programs that will serve as representative payee for a client, although those are becoming more and more few and far between because it's such an intensive service. If the client has a loved one they trust, a power of attorney can be a useful tool, although I know I'm preaching to the choir when I say that POAs are often used as a quote-unquote license to steal and to exploit clients, so that needs to be done with care. APS sometimes in certain states has specific restraining orders available to them in many states that bar an exploiter from contacting an older adult or residing with that older adult. And then APS in many states often has orders of protection where they can take some sort of action, especially in an emergency, to stop the exploitation. Sometimes these are used to freeze bank accounts. And in the most extreme cases, APS may pursue a guardian or a conservator to take over the victim's financial matters. As you all know, this is only appropriate in cases where the victim has been declared incompetent by a judge, and it's the most extreme intervention that's available to APS. And there are some APS programs in the country that don't have guardianship as an intervention, although those are few in number. You will find there are some programs that do not resort to guardianship necessary. So we'll come back to Mrs. G a little bit. This is the case that Deirdre talked about earlier. Again, she's an 84-year-old woman. She had family and a niece who moved in with her that had substance abuse issues, drinking issues. She had utilities that were shut off, really bad home condition. Her family members became, or at least one family member became power of attorney for her. These are some of the things that could happen in this situation. Obviously APS will investigate the allegations. Even if Mrs. G denies exploitation, when shown documentation, there are things that can be done. Maybe APS will have her evaluated for capacity or competency by a psychologist. And then they could even apply for guardianship or get a public guardian appointed for that person. If a guardian is appointed, they can also get the home cleaned up, put some home health services in. They can have the family members move out if necessary, and then make sure that the family members don't have access to the funds anymore. And again, guardianship is in the most extreme cases when it comes to APS. So these are a few things that could definitely happen in that case. And then this slide just details some resources. Deirdre, just jump in if there's any you want to specifically highlight. Obviously, APS is mentioned here. Veterans Affairs, I found veteran services can be very helpful. Working with older adults. Yeah, they really are great. And there's a lot of things that Veteran Affairs can do that other systems cannot do. There's a lot of, I've had Veterans Affairs offices go in and get furniture for clients, believe it or not. So there's a lot of services available there. You may be surprised to see the U.S. Postal Inspection Service on here, but I know my organization has talked with them several times about what they can do with this problem, especially when it comes to scams. The FBI's gotten involved in some of these cases. And then things just like Meals on Wheels can be really helpful when you have a caregiver who's exploited a client and can't prepare meals anymore. This helps them be independent if you have to get that caregiver out of there. So, Deirdre, anything else you want to add about these resources?
Just that oftentimes, and this goes to, I'm going to try to address some of the questions that have come in too here. A lot of times for attorneys, it doesn't feel, and for anybody, it doesn't feel like there's a lot that can be done. And you're stymied by this, okay, I think something in my gut is up here. I don't know what it is, and I don't know how to handle it. If you really are at a loss, oftentimes the best thing you can do is try to find services for the person so that there's eyes and ears in the home. We're huge proponents of getting, information, getting somebody to see what's going on. I mean, if Misty, and it's very possible when you go back to that case when the attorney met with her in the office that she presented in a certain way. And maybe that attorney doesn't know that the clothes she was wearing were the same clothes she's been wearing for the last 3 weeks. Maybe that attorney doesn't understand that there's no food in the refrigerator and that there's nowhere for her to sleep but on the couch. There's all these facts that are really relevant that somebody outside of the home isn't going to be aware of or know. And it's also a great way around the people, the issue that it is not reported, that a victim is not going to want to come forward and say, my niece is taking my money.
Right.
But if you can get somebody who goes in there and then is connected to other services, oftentimes that's just a great way around figuring out what's going on, and it leaves the attorney in a situation where you're offering assistance.
Well, I think it comes back to what you said earlier, Deirdre, about asking them to come back so you establish a history with the person. You can see if they've come into your office twice, if they have the same clothes on, if the situation hasn't changed. But then, to get someone in who's seeing the case on a regular basis, you should consider calling your area agency on aging if you don't feel like it rises to the level of Adult Protective Services. Every area in the country has some sort of area agency on aging, or AAA, as it's referred to, that you can contact and see if there's any services you can get in for them. So, yeah.
And people are often more receptive to services. I mean, if you're saying to them, oh, you can have free meals delivered to your home, and secretly your motivation is, I want somebody to be checking in and making sure, and not that Meals on Wheels person is responsible for doing something, but they may see something that you outside of the home will not see. And the person receiving the benefit doesn't necessarily think of it as being some sort of intervention. Rather, they're saying, oh, I'm getting free food. Fantastic.
Yep.
And all of these resources here are all really aimed toward figuring out what resources are in your community and understanding where you might be able to go for some assistance if you don't feel as an attorney like there's anything that you know to do, or that you feel like you would be violating something, or you're not really sure. Got a person.
And I think one thing I didn't put on my slides, which I should have now that I think about it, is if you have not reported to APS before and you feel like you should report something to APS, you can go to my agency's website, which is www.napsa-now.org, and we have a list of all the state reporting numbers there, and you can find the number for your area if you feel like you need to make a report.
Okay, great. I'm going to go to some of the questions now, if that's all right.
Yeah.
Okay, so I may go a little bit out of order because I just think it may make sense. Somebody is requesting to see the APS Code of Ethics slide again. So Andy, could you go back to that slide and we can address some of the questions while that's up there? I think somebody agreed it's important to understand victims' rights, and so they wanted to see that again. Great. So here's the first question is, can the isolation of a resident in an assisted living center by an out-of-town child from an in-town resident's relatives visits a form of abuse? Under what circumstances? And then there's a follow-up to that. So if I understand the question correctly, basically there's a situation that the person's describing where, is isolation in an assisted living place considered abuse? For me, and then Andy, I'll ask, ask it from the APS perspective too. But from my perspective, just generally speaking, why, sure, it definitely, isolation could absolutely be a form of abuse. This person asks, under what circumstances? Well, certainly if it's contrary, as the question then later says, if it's contrary to the person's wishes. However, each state will be guided by the regulations, because then the question goes on to ask, may the facility which enforces the isolation also be responsible? What if the isolation is contrary to the resident's wishes? So I think there's a couple issues you have to ask, which is, one, what is the capacity of the person who is wishing those visits? And, you know, how much that plays a role, what level of capacity, if it's been an adjudication by a judge, if there's a guardian appointed, perhaps it's the guardian that needs to be making that decision. But every state is also going to be guided by regulations by the Department of Health. And the Department of Health clearly states, for instance, in New York, where I'm from, where I live, that, you know, if visits affect the safety and well-being of other residents or of the resident or staff members, then they can be prohibited. So, you know, from a shelter perspective, we frankly often prohibit visits as a matter of policy because of the way we operate, and our concern for the safety of the individual. But on the flip side, isolation absolutely is a form of abuse. So I don't know, Andy, if you have a different perspective.
No, I agree with you. I think, yeah, it can definitely be abuse. And what it boils down to is whether the older adult, you know, is the sort of person who normally engages in social activity, or if they're the kind of person who tends to kind of be on their own. If they want to be more social and they're being restricted from that, yeah, that's definitely abuse. And social isolation, this is a quote that I use a lot in presentations, is public enemy number one, I think, for elder abuse. People who are isolated, nobody sees if they're being abused. Now, there are, you know, people who aren't terribly social and don't want to be, you know, out with other people at a given time. But, yeah, I think it can definitely be abuse, if especially in the case of someone who's normally been very socially active and then now is very withdrawn, or someone is trying to obstruct them from being seen by someone else. It's a red flag for sure, definitely.
Okay, I'm going to go on to another question. I think, Andy, this is really for you. It sounds like a policy question or a procedural question. What typically happens when there is notice of potential elder abuse, and after some investigation, the age of the older adult is found to be under the state minimum?
It depends on the state. I think I mentioned this earlier. You know, the vast majority of states, it's anyone over the age of 18 who's considered vulnerable. And the definition of vulnerable is different from state to state, but it usually involves some sort of form of disability. But there are a handful of states that only see people over age 60. So if you are talking about a state where they only see people over age 60 and you find out the client is 59, 58, what have you, they would not be able to do an investigation. They would likely have to stop. Or if there is another organization in their state outside of APS who does that investigation, they may refer it on to that other organization, but that would depend on where the person lives, if they're getting developmental disability services or not. It can get really kind of complicated. But if they're found to be under the age of the threshold to investigate, their jurisdiction is kind of cut off at that point, and they're pretty limited about what they can do.
I think, though, to your point about referring on, that while, and this is what we see here a lot with any kinds of, I mean, often agencies, there you have to abide by the requirements and policies of your agency. We're lucky here that we have some flexibility into our shelter. So although our age is 60, once in a while we'll see somebody, somebody will come in who reflects, you know, early dementia or medical conditions that are really more like one of an older adult, and we can make some sort of exception. But no matter what, my experience has been that agencies always do their best to refer on to somebody else. If somebody is in need of help, it is very unlikely that they're just going to be left without any resources, despite the fact that, you know, Adult Protective Services or any other agency is really guided by their specific cutoff in terms of age.
And I think the main, probably the biggest thing to point out with that is if they go out and they find someone's under the age, you know, these legal interventions that I was talking about, like guardianship, are not going to be available to APS. But that doesn't mean they can't make a phone call to refer them to, you know, Meals on Wheels, which are available for people under 60. or some other kind of service, just like you were saying. Yeah.
Okay. I just want to reference I mentioned oh, you know what, Andy? The person who wanted to see the slide says that she actually meant the next page, which shows the victim's rights. So we can have that going on in the background. Thank you.
Yep. Sure.
So there have been several questions and comments about the New Yorker article, which I mentioned, and I think there's somebody who in the questions didn't reference it as the New Yorker article, but stated all the facts in it. So I'm sorry I didn't send that along as part of any kind of attachment to it. It was a very interesting article, a very sad article about how public guardians really abused their position and took advantage of older adults. So the specific question, so first of all, to those who are interested in having it, I believe you could actually just Google, New Yorker and elder abuse and public guardian. But if you have any difficulty finding it, please feel free to contact me. I'm happy to pass the link along. It's not difficult. But there is a specific question. Andy, it sounds like you're familiar with that article. In general, is there APS protection against something like this?
Yeah, there are. It's not unheard of for APS to get a report of a perpetrator who is the guardian or the conservator, as it's often called in California. That's not unusual. I had cases like that when I worked on the front lines in APS, and they can investigate. Often they can contact the court and ask them to review this guardianship. So there are interventions available, and yes, you can report those cases. Now, every state or sometimes counties in certain states are going to have different ways that they tackle those programs, or those situations. But yeah, you can certainly call APS about a guardian who is being abusive towards a client, and that goes for financial exploitation or neglect or any of those forms of abuse we've talked about so far. Definitely.
All right. There are some questions about, let's see. There was a question about for attorneys, what can you do exactly? And then another person went on to say, and I think his point is well taken, there's a huge price to pay pulling the trigger if you're wrong. The putative, abused adult who disagrees with the reporting will ditch the lawyer, kid, or other reporter. This has long-term consequences since the caring reporter will not get the chance to do the same again. Thus, the inclination can be to let things go along longer so that the facts become more clear. Are there any meaningful criteria in making that first report that the reporter can use other than his or her own ethical sense? Go ahead, Eddie.
That's a tricky question, and unfortunately, this is not a cop-out, but I have to say it sometimes varies from state to state. It depends on the mandatory reporting laws and what the definition of a vulnerable adult is and what their definition of abuse is. I think I usually tell people to err on the side of reporting, but I get the point that's being made and the concern about that. I really do. I will say this. In my experience, all APS programs will hold the name of the person who has made the report confidential, even to the subject of the report. So if you're working with Mrs. G and you make a report on Mrs. G, when APS goes out, they're not going to tell her that you're the one who called. Now, that doesn't mean that she won't be able to figure it out. Sometimes maybe you're the only one who knows the information that's contained in the report, and by process of elimination, she can determine who made that report. But in my experience, it's held confidential, and they will not say that you're the one to contact if you made that report. But I get what the concern is. You have to weigh the risk to the client and how bad the situation is, certainly.
And I think that New York State happens to be one of happens to be the state that does not have any mandatory reporting, and it's a tough thing. And I think elder abuse presents in ways that, what would the criteria be? It's almost, some of these things are intuitive. or in your gut, I know something's wrong. I mean, for instance, I just got a call today from somebody who had questions about whether or not there was abuse going on, and they just sensed it, but nothing they could put their finger on. So it's very challenging. We suggest elder abuse screening and using it as a tool as part of your intake process. But it's really challenging. With that, it's 2 o'clock. I think we've come to an end. Andrew, thank you so much. Really appreciate the partnership
Thanks
and
for inviting
presentation.
me. Yeah, thanks
thank everyone
for all the information you gave us. Thanks.
Yeah. Well, thank you very much to everyone joining us today. Take care. Have a great day. If anybody has questions, please feel free to send us emails, and we will do our best to get back to you.